Please be seated. Order, Mr. Buckley.
Mr. Speaker, Standing Order 69, subsection 5b, relates to members' interest. It states in relation to declarations, and I quote, "A member who has a relevant interest in the matter must declare that interest before taking part in any proceedings of the Assembly relating to that matter." Can I ask the Speaker, given his involvement as sharing the Bobby Story funeral on his social media sites, can he inform the House, has he sought advice in relation to this matter? Given the huge public interest in today's proceedings and the crisis in confidence and accountability now at the heart of this Assembly, it is in the public interest and for the credibility of this Assembly and in the interest of transparency that today's debate is seen to be charged by someone who does not have a perceived conflict of interest. Has the Speaker taken such advice, and can he share it with the House?
Well, I want to thank the member for raising the point of order. The member will know that this matter has been raised before, and I have made it very clear that in the first instance, under no circumstances would I wish to breach any guidelines, and I want to make that very clear yet again. I have sought advice, and I am perfectly entitled and able to participate and preside over this particular meeting, which has been called today, to discuss a very important matter. So I am satisfied that I am well able and professional enough to conduct my role as a Speaker, as I think that I have proven that since the day I took up this role, that no one can say that I have acted in any prejudicial way to anyone or to any party on any item of business over the past year, and I will stand over that record until the day I leave this particular position, and would make members to recognise that fact. So, as far as I'm concerned, it is in order for me to preside over this proceedings. We draw to your attention that two of the Deputy Speakers have signed the motion today. One or the other, the Principal Deputy Speaker, is on record as saying he will be speaking on this matter, which they're quite entitled to do so. So I think it's incumbent for us as the chairs of these proceedings that we act in a professional manner, that we conduct ourselves in the impartial and independent manner that we are obliged to do by law. I stand over my role in that, I stand over my competence in that, and I stand over my professionalism in that. So therefore, as far as I'm concerned, the issue of the post which was shared in my local constituency Facebook page, which I don't manage, which I never see, that was advertising the online streaming of the event, and I have no further comment to make on that matter.
Mr. Speaker, given that you shared the social media post promoting a mass gathering during COVID regulations that prohibited such gatherings, given that not only that but some of your family members attended said funeral, is it in order for the House to adjourn to see the advice that you have received to ensure that we can have credibility in today's proceedings and the public can rightly ask for the transparency in this place, given what has gone on over this past few days?
Well, I just want to make my final comment on that, and I think you're starting to stray into very difficult territory when you're starting to refer to members of my family, and I think you should desist from that line of an approach. As far as I'm concerned, members of this House can all testify to my impartiality and independence in presiding over all the proceedings that I have done so in the past year. Members of this House and the general public will be able to determine by the end of these proceedings this afternoon that I have continued to act professionally and conducted myself on the basis of the legal status that I have here, that I am professional, competent and well within my entitlements to preside over these proceedings in a professional manner. And I prefer, and in fact, I will not be responding to any further points of order on this.
The credibility of these institutions are at stake. The public are rightly calling for transparency. I in no way am making comment on your previous conduct in the chair. What I am saying is that I perceive, and indeed many in our community and in this House perceive, there to be a direct conflict of interest as to you proceeding as chair during this debate. I would ask further, can the House adjourn to receive such advice that you have been given, And if it is such a point where the Deputy Speakers are not available, can we not move to a point where we appoint a temporary Speaker to ensure that the public can have confidence in this sitting today?
As a point of order, Mr. Frew.
Mr. Speaker, given everything you've said in response to my colleague, and whether you've stated out your position on the guidance for which you lead, is it wise for you to have the chair in this debate?
Look, all I would say is that there are matters which arise in this chamber throughout the tenure of all mandates. There are often very difficult and very challenging debates which ensue, which have to be presided over by somebody. From the start of this Assembly in 1998, 1999, there have been many debates, very difficult and very challenging controversial matters. The Speaker of the day has always presided over those matters. We've always determined by the end of each mandate and each tenure that the Speakers have, whether people like them or not individually, regardless of anything else. But the fact of the matter is we've always made sure that we live by the rulings of the Speakers. The Speakers have always managed the proceedings of the Assembly in a professional, independent and impartial manner. You've acknowledged that you have no grounds upon which to accuse me of doing anything else since I took on this role. So I would invite you then to make your judgment at the end of the proceedings, when I will again demonstrate my professional ability and my, as I say, my impartiality and independence in the way in which I conduct the business of this Assembly.
Speaker, this is a credibility issue in relation to the debate that we have before us today. There's public confidence at stake here. I would urge the Speaker to adjourn the House, to brief party leaders as to the advice that he has received, and seek for a temporary Speaker. Thousands of families have had to endure restrictions whereby they laid their loved ones to rest in isolation. Meanwhile, we have a party in this House, namely Sinn Féin, that went to that funeral and had no regard for the regulations that were put in place. Mr. Speaker, that is calling into question your credibility for being an independent chair in this debate, given your role in that funeral as by promoting it online. So I would ask the Speaker very clearly to think of the credibility of this institution and allow members time to hear the advice and reconsider and put a temporary Speaker in place.
Well, you will be aware that it's not the common practice at all, the convention or the appropriate matter to do, to give people advice on legal advice that one has received. So therefore I propose that we should move on into the debate and let people judge the credibility of the proceedings at the end of the proceedings, because it's an unusual step to adjourn on such a fashion. As I've said, there are many issues which are challenging for all sides of the House. So no matter who would be taking on the chair of any particular session, then there may well be questions asked as to whether or not that was appropriate or not. We have to judge the Speakers and respect the role of the Speakers, even though sometimes we may be uncomfortable about the matters being under debate. And that's my view on that.
Outlined the standing order by which I think this has to be adjourned. A relevant interest to any matter must declare that interest before taking part in any proceedings of the Assembly relating to that matter. There is no doubt on this matter that is before us today, this very serious issue of public confidence. Your own impartiality is in question, and I would ask the Speaker, for the credibility of this institution and for the sake of this debate today, to adjourn the House, appoint a temporary Speaker and allow a fair hearing of this debate today that can be perceived by all in our community as being fair and balanced.
Well, I've heard the member, and again I thank the member for bringing this to the attention of the Assembly. It has been discussed before. In fact, it was discussed last July, as I understand it, when I was still shielding. And as far as I'm concerned, I've made a ruling that I have received advice. I'm satisfied that I have proven, since the moment I took up my office as Speaker of this House, that I have demonstrated my utmost professional and impartiality and independence in the conduct of my role. I will continue to do that, and people will judge me on that basis. And I'm satisfied that the judgment will be one which is positive. So the Speaker's ruling is final. I don't intend to adjourn the House. I intend to proceed with the matter on the order paper, and let's then conduct this business on the professional basis that we're here to do, and give confidence to the public that the very important matter which is on the subject of the motion today will be dealt with professionally in a mature way. People will have their robust arguments and so on and so forth, and that's entitlement of every member of this House. I've made a ruling. The Speaker's ruling is final, and I'm asking people to respect that, and I want to move on to the agenda itself on the order paper.
Speaker, I'm sorry, but I can't let this drop, because public confidence is at stake. You asked that we proceed in a professional and mature manner. Surely a professional and mature manner would mean an impartial chair who has no perceived conflict of interest on this matter. We have the ability to appoint temporary speakers. It was done when this was debated in July. I would ask that it is done again and that we can ensure full public confidence on this matter.
Mr Buckley, I have made a ruling, and the Speaker's ruling is final, as you are well aware. You and I have had discussions about this matter privately in my office in the last number of months. I think you fully understand my position. You yourself have personally acknowledged in this House this morning that you have no issue to take with any of the conduct of my role as Speaker. So, as I've said, I've made a ruling. I'm not going to change that ruling, and I want us to move on to the order paper and conduct the business as we're here to discuss today. Thank you. Members, I wish to inform the Assembly that the Budget Bill has received royal assent. The Budget Act NI 2021 became law on the 23rd of March 2021. It is Chapter 4. Moving on to the private members' business, the order paper. And members, before we begin the debate today, I want to make clear that I am not aware of any active proceedings in relation to the matter addressed by the motion, and therefore the sub judice rule does not apply today. However, I am aware that a statement from the PPS yesterday referred to an entirely separate decision to prosecute two individuals. Members are therefore encouraged not to refer to the substance of what may be active criminal proceedings if they do so. If they do so, they must ensure that their remarks will not prejudice the outcome. As I've said, the sub judice rule does not apply to the motion in hand this morning. Members have been given notice by not less than 30 members under Standing Order 11. I have summoned the Assembly to meet today for the purpose of debating a motion on breaches of executive COVID-19 messaging by ministers. Clerk, please read the motion.
That this Assembly acknowledges the pain endured by families across Northern Ireland who have experienced loss during the COVID-19 crisis, expresses its sincere condolences to those who, in periods of trauma and loss, were unable to say goodbye to loved ones, further expresses its gratitude to those who have followed the public health guidelines and played their part in keeping their neighbourhoods, communities and the health service safe, regrets the actions of those in positions of elected office who breached the Executive's public health messaging and undermined efforts to prevent transmission of the virus, and condemns the Deputy First Minister and the Minister for Finance for their actions which have caused immense hurt and undermined the Executive's public health message.
And I call Nichola Mallon to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak.
Thank you. The Business Committee has agreed to allow up to 2 hours for this debate. You will have 10 minutes to speak or to propose the motion and 10 minutes to wind. All other speakers will have 5 minutes. As the motion refers specifically to two individuals, they will be given an opportunity to reply as private members at the end of the debate, should they wish to do so. Before we begin the debate, I want to make clear that I am not aware of any active proceedings in relation to the matters addressed by the motion, and therefore the sub judice rule does not apply. I call on Ms Mallon to open the debate.
Mr Speaker, I rise to speak as the Deputy Leader of the SDLP, and with deep regret that in the midst of a public health crisis, we have had to come here today to give voice to so many of our citizens who feel so hurt and so betrayed. I rise not to score any political points, not to add to the grief of any family in the North who have lost a loved one in the last year, and certainly not to undermine the critically important messages and instructions that we must all continue to follow in regard to suppressing COVID-19 and moving our people into a more hopeful and new era. I do as a political leader who genuinely believes that we are, in fact, all in this together, and that all those in power must be held to account for their actions. That belief that we must all adhere to the regulations, the guidelines, look out for and support each other, that has been my approach and the approach of the Social Democratic and Labour Party to dealing with the pandemic. In the Executive, here in the Assembly, in our communities, in our sports clubs, at our school gates and on the ground, and we will not deviate from that. In the Executive, in this Assembly, we have asked our citizens to make huge sacrifices. The biggest sacrifice asked of our people since last March has been that asked of the family and friends of the deceased. To bury a loved one with no wake and only a small number of people in attendance robs us of a final act of love, an act of grace in parting, and a final comfort for the bereaved. It goes against our very nature. We have a uniquely Irish way of managing death, and it gives enormous comfort to our people to open up their doors when faced with death, to embrace the comfort offered by our family and community. On this island, our wakes and burials are a crucial act of closure. The restrictions require people to set that aside, and what a sacrifice that is. And our people said, almost unanimously, if that's what must be done, we will do it. Most of us will know someone, directly or indirectly, who has buried a loved one during the pandemic, perhaps stood on the roadside as a cortege has driven past, or watched a funeral service on Zoom. It doesn't even amount to a substitute for the true way these things should be done. So when the leadership of Sinn Féin and 22 of that party's elected representatives decided to attend a funeral and a graveside rally last June, it was a knowing act. It wasn't surrounded in ambiguity. There wasn't a slight question mark over whether public health advice, guidelines and legislation were broken. Please don't let us hear that today. It is an insult to the bereaved across Northern Ireland, across our island. It is an insult to all those who have followed and adhered to the rules over the past 12 months. It was a proactive decision they chose to make. They made the choice. They knew the consequences for public health would be severe, even fatal, but they still made that choice. They knew that hundreds of other families had acted within the law, the guidelines and the public health advice. They knew that by their actions, they were putting themselves above the law, but they still made that choice. They knew too there would be political fallout, but they still made that choice. They knew what the restrictions they designed and implemented in the Executive meant. They knew because, along with the guidance and public health advice, the Deputy First Minister and the Finance Minister made them. I sat in the meeting and saw them do it, and then I watched on television as they broke them. And if they were confused, as they subsequently claimed in police interviews, why did they not raise this around the Executive table at the time? Why did they pretend to the public during the daily press conferences that they did understand? If virtually every family knew, then why didn't Sinn Féin public representatives know? The truth is, they did. We all knew, but they chose to break them anyway. It was a deliberate, proactive calculation that they would set aside the law they had made because it suited their agenda. They made that choice. Sinn Féin made the choice not to stand with the people, but put themselves above them. Over the past few days, there has been commentary in certain quarters that the SDLP is acting for political capital. That is untrue. Today, it is not just the SDLP who is calling out the purposeful rule-breaking, but every single party in the Executive, alongside our colleagues in the Green Party. This is not a political fight. This is a question of doing what is right. It is to show people, the families across our island who have made huge sacrifices, that those who imposed the rules then broke them, and they must be held to account. This is no longer about a funeral. It is now an issue of why Sinn Féin believes they are above the restrictions, above the law, above the public health advice. We are here today to hear Sinn Féin account for their actions, to answer the question countless citizens across the North are asking: why is it one rule for the political elite in Sinn Féin and one rule for the rest of us? Had the Deputy First Minister acknowledged last July that mistakes had been made, had she made a sincere apology then, I believe we wouldn't be here today. But the arrogance of Sinn Féin and the refusal to acknowledge, explain, give a full apology brings us here today. Enough of the wordplay. No more diluted, craftily worded apologies. I ask the leadership of Sinn Féin, let this be the day when, without qualification or equivocation, you do offer the people of the North a full explanation. At all times, but especially in a crisis, people look to those in positions of political leadership to be honest with them, to protect them, to put their interests first and to lead by example. They look to leaders to stand with them, not above them, to hold themselves to a higher standard, not a different standard, and at the very least follow the rules they and their parties set. All of us, and there can be no excuses, are fully aware of the 7 rules of public life that all ministers have committed to upholding: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership. Leadership underpins it all. And the truth is, be it the actions of Sammy Wilson and Arlene Foster's refusal to sanction and condemn his actions, or the actions of Michelle O'Neill and Conor Murphy in this instance, people rightly feel failed. And just as people look to their political leaders for leadership, at all times people look to the police for independence, impartiality, and therefore consistency up in holding the rule of law. Where is the consistency in the policing response to the Black Lives Matter protesters, to the family of those remembering their loved ones brutally murdered at Sean Graham's Bookmakers on the Ormer Road, to the crowd of loyalist paramilitaries in Pitt Park, to the funeral of Francie McNally, to the funeral of Bobby Storey? These are serious questions, and we will rigorously pursue all of these answers through the accountability structures of the Policing Board. As I draw my remarks to a close, I call on this Assembly to stand up for people across our island who have made so many sacrifices, to stand up for truth and justice, for fairness and for accountability. It is what all of the families grieving across our island, all of our citizens struggling through this painful pandemic deserve. Mr. Speaker, the SDLP brought this motion today to give voice to our citizens. And as I end, I want to make a plea to the people across Northern Ireland who have faithfully followed the asks made of them time and time again at the joint press conferences by the First and Deputy First Ministers. I want to appeal to all those who have adhered to the regulations and guidance set, who made countless personal sacrifices for the common good, and who rightly feel angry and betrayed. I plead with the people of Northern Ireland, and in the words of James Main, a grieving son who couldn't lift his father's coffin, who watched his father's cremation through a screen, who sacrificed that crucial act of closure we all need. Regardless of those who break the rules, please know you're a better person for following them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, and I call Arlene Foster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in Northern Ireland, often too much is made of what divides us. But what we do hold in common is a reverence for life, for family and for community. And that's demonstrated by how we remember people in death, displayed in the support for those who grieve, whether it's at the wake, the funeral or the time afterwards. And these are unspoken obligations inherited right down throughout the generations. All of us who made the decisions and set the rules knew that the regulations on wakes and funerals would be the limits on life that would cut the deepest, that would ask the most of those at their lowest moment and frustrate the most basic human response to console the grieving. It is to the immense credit of the bereaved and their families and communities right across all of Northern Ireland that the most difficult limit on our lives was abided by throughout the pandemic by the vast majority. They bore a heavier burden than us. They protected us. They acted in the common good. The credit they deserve is only matched by the shame that Sinn Féin should feel for their actions last June. I take nothing away from the grieving family on that occasion. For Sinn Féin, however, they chose to act in a way that breached the regulations on funerals at that time, and in so doing happily sent a signal to everyone else in Northern Ireland that it was one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. The actions of senior Sinn Féin representatives, the Sinn Féin Deputy First Minister, their executive ministers, Sinn Féin members of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, sparked the political crisis. And once again, the message from Sinn Féin was clear: ourselves alone, ourselves first, regardless of the cost of undermining the public health messaging. The wake, the funeral procession of thousands, the political rally were clear and premeditated breaches of the COVID regulations. The prioritisation at Roselawn over other grieving families was hurtful, ignorant and callous in the extreme. Acts of arrogance, acts of self-entitlement, acts of privilege. Sinn Féin calls for equality, respect and integrity, but actually demonstrates the opposite. When someone believes that they are above the law, where clear and premeditated breaches of COVID regulations were made, it has to be said that there is a rightful expectation of everyone that the police and the justice system shows that they are not above the law. And what adds insult to injury is that that rightful expectation has been failed. Sadly, the police abdicated its responsibilities before the funeral, at the funeral and since the funeral. Decisions not to gather evidence, collaboration and knowledge of the plan of breaking regulations facilitated the breaches of thousands, foot-dragging on the investigation. And now individually all of those are unacceptable, but collectively they show that something is very much wrong. Much work will be required to rebuild levels of confidence within the community of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and that really does concern me, because it's the failure of the PSNI command that has become a primary justification for the PPS refusal to prosecute, allied with the absurdity from the PPS that ignorance of the law is a defence in general. The Northern Ireland public were not confused about the law, and yet we are asked to believe that those who enacted the laws were confused.
Will the member give way?
Yes, I will give way.
Can I ask the member, the First Minister, if she was at any point confused by the regulations, and if it's credible for people to say that they were confused by the regulations whenever they were involved in the drafting and passing of that legislation?
The member has an additional minute.
Well, I wasn't confused about the regulations. We had many discussions on policy. We took advice from our Chief Medical Officer, from our Chief Scientific Advisor, and let me say there are many funerals I should have been at, but I wasn't at. I wasn't at. Many will say that Sinn Féin has no sense of shame. That may very well be true, but cannot be the way forward. Today, it is important that we start the journey forward with a common rejection of the idea that there are different rules and laws for different groups of people. For our part, we hold strong to the cherished ideal that all citizens are equal under the law and equally subject to the law. If we are to build a better society for all, it must be fair for all. We must unite around this principle if we are to do what is right. No exceptions, no special favours for Sinn Féin or anyone else. And while the Deputy First Minister and the Finance Minister and their colleagues have tried to justify their behaviour and excuse their elitist attitudes to everything that has happened, we cannot tread that path. So today, in closing, Mr. Speaker, I, my party, stand with those families who sacrificed so much, so very, very much, for the common good of Northern Ireland. The battle to defend and protect the principle of equality before the law is more intense than ever, but it is a cause we must win for everyone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And before we move on, could I ask Ms Mallon to formally move the motion?
I formally move the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And I call Michelle O'Neill.
And firstly, can I also confirm that I am speaking in the Chamber today in my role as an MLA? I take this opportunity to contribute to, as I have done on every available opportunity over the past 9 months since the death of my friend Bobby Story. I have done so in this chamber on many occasions, at the TEO Committee, at the Executive, at the Party Leaders Forum and via the media press conferences. I wish to again say it today and to put on the public record that I am truly sorry for the hurt that has been caused to so many families who have lost a loved one during this time. My attendance at the funeral of Bobby Story was to support a family during their grief as he was laid to rest. Over the past 9 months, I have worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and confidence with the public as a result of undermining the public health message, and I will continue to work every day with ministerial colleagues, and I will continue to work across the 5 parties to take us through what is a global health pandemic, to save lives and to protect livelihoods. I am truly sorry that my actions have contributed to the grief or the heartache that has been felt and experienced by many people who've lost a loved one during this pandemic. That was never, ever my intention. And for that, I offer my heartfelt and unreserved apology to those families that have lost a loved one. I take very seriously my responsibility as a public office holder and as Deputy First Minister and Joint Head of Government. The events of that day were investigated by the police, with whom I gave, as you would expect, my full cooperation. The report published on the 30th of March by the PPS set out its judgment, which was made independently and impartially by the team of senior prosecutors assisted by senior counsel. I now understand a review of that judgment has now been requested, and I'll await the outcome of that. Nevertheless, it is unfortunate that this matter has divided the Executive and the Assembly that many of us worked so hard to bring about and to restore in order to get on with delivering public services to the public to whom we serve. We have made good progress in suppressing the virus and establishing a route map out of restrictions and in vaccinating the population despite all of the difficulties. The progress that has been achieved is entirely due to the support and the concerted effort of everyone. As a result, we have now reached a key turning point in the management of this crisis, where the Executive's attention is now able to move from purely controlling the public health response towards planning for economic health and societal recovery instead. My sincere commitment is to continue with this work, and that remains my #1 priority.
Thank you. And I call Steve Aiken.
Mr. Speaker, the events surrounding the funeral of Bobby Story, with the mass breaching of the COVID rules and regulations by members of Sinn Féin, including the Deputy First Minister, the Finance Minister, MLAs, TDs and other elected representatives, has now undermined the rather limited faith the people of Northern Ireland have in the integrity of our government, the rule of law and indeed in the very process of democracy itself. At the core of all our concerns is now the fact, rather than the perception, that there is now a 2-tier justice and policing system here in Northern Ireland. There is one rule for Sinn Féin and another for the rest of us. For those of us who could not attend funerals of our loved ones and believed by our actions we could reduce the enormous burden on our health service, and believed in the adherence of rules, thought that our sacrifice would be matched by those that were in government. Indeed, that we all had a very reasonable expectation that those very government members who set and agreed the regulations would show leadership and actually follow the rules that they had agreed. There are many of us, despite our political differences, recognise a sorrowing and grieving family. I can understand grief, and I say to all of us, we cannot forget the very real sadness of the Story family. the fact that the loss that they suffered is being revisited by these events. But there are many others, including those of the Hume and Dalit family, and thousands of others who also wanted to grieve, but who accepted sacrifices had to be made for the good of us all. These families did not have organisers, stewards and liaisons, or coordination organised between the police and elected representatives. They did not allow their funerals to be used for propaganda. But above all, they did not flout the rules. Not because they didn't want to grieve, Mr. Speaker, but because they understood that in the midst of a pandemic, it was the right thing to do. So let us remember why these rules and regulations were introduced and by whom. We are in the midst of an unprecedented public health emergency that has cost so far 2,115 lives and has infected over 120,000. Many of those who continue to suffer from long-term effects. There is also no doubt that there will have been and are direct links between crowds, proximity, public gatherings and the spread of the disease. While Sinn Féin opposite believes that the rule of law does not apply to them, the sharp scientific reality of viral infection does. Sinn Féin and its followers are not somehow immune. Infection, as they themselves have been keen to point out, recognises no borders. Indeed, by breaching the Irish Republic's rules of distance and travel, Sinn Féin's president and their finance spokesperson and the many others who travelled to Belfast broached those rules and regulations. They were, in all probability, vectors for the very disease that the Northern Ireland Executive, which Sinn Féin is supposedly part of, said it was trying to control. In the midst of a pandemic, why would you risk it? Unless, of course, unfortunately, you didn't care. We have heard today that this isn't an orange and green issue. It isn't. It's an issue of public health, integrity and morality of government. The first duty of any government, regardless of circumstances, is the protection and safety of its people. Not a small section or an interest group or even a political party, of all the people. The old, the sick, the vulnerable, above all, the vital healthcare and public service workers who have, on several occasions, been nearly overwhelmed by the tsunami of hospital admissions. It was to prevent the collapse of our national healthcare system, to stop our hospitals being overwhelmed, to prevent running out of ventilators and ICU beds, and to stop the burnout of critical staff that restrictions on our daily lives were introduced. Restrictions that none of us wanted, but restrictions based on the best scientific, medical and UK-wide advice that was available. We must all continue to follow that. But, Mr. Speaker, as I draw our remarks to a close, I thought today that the Deputy First Minister had the opportunity to, rather than to apologise to this Assembly about the hurt that there was, but for actually breaching those rules and regulations and for actually attending that funeral. I have not heard that. That is what the people of Northern Ireland wanted to hear today to draw a line under this. Is there an opportunity that she might change her remarks and actually address the real issue on hand? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And I call Kellie Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If anyone had said a year ago we would be here on April Fool's Day to discuss how, after announcing to the public to stay at home in lockdown, a party of the recently formed executive would then ignore that message and instead choose to congregate in a group of up to 2,000 people, with the result that our pandemic public health message was undermined, I think anyone would have said, no way, that's not possible. So much for new decade, new approach. Here we are discussing the actions of Sinn Féin, who knew their actions were not in the spirit of the regulations, but who chose to flout the guidance because the Republican family needed them. No matter the technicalities of law that led PPS to their decision, Sinn Féin played fast and loose with the rules they asked the rest of us to follow. I am one of the families that lost a loved one who was not allowed to attend a funeral. My aunt was one of the many people who saw her husband go into hospital only to never come out, to never have a wake, to have a closed casket, to only have a few people by her side as he was laid to rest. I come from a large family. We are extremely close. We wanted to be there for her, to pay our respects to him, and to grieve as we would normally have done. We couldn't. We stuck to the rules. We didn't find a loophole. Today, my intention is not to upset a grieving family. Sinn Féin brought them into the spotlight through their own actions. By holding their own version of a state funeral, they decided nothing would stand in the way of a public show of Republican strength for a former senior member of the IRA, even a health pandemic. That event, I know, has been accepted by Minister O'Neill as having undermined our COVID health message. Not just at the moment, please. I put to this House the impact of that event possibly led to the spread of the virus and more COVID deaths as people disregarded the advice then to stay at home. It's not enough to apologise for the hurt that others feel. On behalf of the Alliance Party, I want a public apology from Sinn Féin for their actions and the event. The event, as Mary Lou MacDonald has confirmed, was meticulously planned. It was wrong. It went against the spirit of the regulations, and they and we all know it. To reiterate, I don't want Sinn Féin leadership to say sorry that I've been hurt or others have been hurt by their action. I want an apology for their action. I want you to say sorry for holding an event that went against the spirit and intention of COVID regulations that you demanded we follow. I don't know at this point if you regret the event, and if it was to happen again, would you do it again? PPS decision or not, this country needs to be able to trust political leaders. Following from RHI, there was a huge hill to climb to undo the damage done by the DUP on that matter. Instead of leading by example, Sinn Féin compounded the public's lack of trust in all of us. I have heard attempts to shift blame onto the police, to the prosecution service, onto the Justice Minister, and even to the Health Minister for how the regulations were written. These are all a distraction. Let's get back to the core issue. Ministers O'Neill and Murphy and others, as outlined in the motion, attended an event that was not within the spirit or intention of the regulations. Will they resign? No. Will this pull down the Assembly again? In the middle of a pandemic and during an economic crisis? It better not. I think I speak for the majority of people outside this House when I say, let's get back to work and stop undermining the very hard work our community is completing and what we're all trying to achieve. I say to both named ministers, instead of talking about being sorry, be sorry. Understand the pain caused to my aunt, to my family, and to the many families who are angry at all of us and at themselves as they ask, why did we stick to the rules? Why didn't we just have a wake and go to our funeral? That horrible, guilt-ridden feeling of not being able to honour our loved ones lingers on. I know. It has been reawakened again with the PPS announcement. It hasn't gone away. We are very close to Easter, another time when families want to be together. An apology would go a long way to help to encourage those who are struggling to stick to the rules over Easter, to know they're doing the right thing by staying at home and not getting together. The message this government needs to share is that we're still in lockdown and regulations matter as they save lives. If leadership fails, the consequence will be another spike in numbers after Easter, and we all know what that means, more lockdown.
Member to all remarks to close, please.
Let me be honest, I'm sick of lockdowns. My family is sick of lockdowns. Our whole community is sick of lockdowns, but we stay in lockdown to protect our loved ones, to protect the community, and to protect our health service. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call Paul Givan.
Mr. Speaker, respect, equality and integrity, Sinn Féin's mantra for many years. Michelle O'Neill, what we are seeking is respect and equality for all the people and integrity in the political institutions. That is what Martin McGuinness stands for. That is what Sinn Féin stands for. That is what I stand for. Michelle O'Neill. Minister in my church responds adequately in my constituency. He emailed me last night. He says, as a result of the decision to not prosecute those who attended the Story funeral, I am at a loss as a clergyman. Hypocrisy. One rule for them, one for everybody else. Injustice. Equality. Just some of the words that I could pen. Goes on to say how he has buried 53 parishioners in his own parish in Lisburn. And all 53 knew the rules, worked with the church, worked with the undertakers, and he says there is much hurt. What I say will have no impact on Sinn Féin, but listen to the hurt from people like that clergyman, from people across Northern Ireland, thousands of people who buried their loved ones over the past year, but special status for this one individual. Not just one individual, a terrorist, but special status for one individual. Where was the respect for the rule of law, broken by the very lawmakers? Where was the equality? Thousands buried. But was Mr. Story treated equally? No. Special status given to that one funeral. Roselawn locked out to other people. Special status given to that one family. Organised by Sinn Féin. Meticulously planned, in the words of the Sinn Féin president, with the PSNI. Meticulously planned. I'll give way.
I thank the member for giving way. Would the member agree with me that seemingly, in the Republican worldview, collusion with the PSNI is perfectly acceptable in certain circumstances?
And I'll get to that point, and I agree with the member. Integrity. Where's the integrity for the Nolan principles of public life? Where's the integrity for the ministerial code that the Deputy First Minister, that the Finance Minister are pledged to? Where's the setting of an example, leading the community? Abandoned when it comes to the special status of a terrorist that needed to be buried. We've heard from the Deputy First Minister more shallow, hollow, meaningless words, unrepentant about organising a funeral, unrepentant about attending the funeral, but sorry that other people in Northern Ireland felt hurt by that attendance. When are we going to hear we were wrong as a political party? I was wrong as the Deputy First Minister to have attended that funeral. But no, the record still remains. The Deputy First Minister will never say sorry for attending the funeral of a friend. What about my friend that died during the past year? I didn't go to that funeral. Should I have went to that funeral? Is my friend not more important than your friend? Many of us didn't go to funerals because of the regulations that this executive has brought in. But this speaks to the behavioural attitude that goes to the core of Sinn Féin, that of supremacy. Not just supremacy over unionism, it's within their own community as well. They are supreme. One rule for us, one rule for others. We see their behaviour in disrespecting when it comes to centenary celebrations, comments about the Prince of Wales, referred to as POW, and so it goes on. New decade, new approach, new spirit of cooperation. No evidence of it, none whatsoever. Consequences flow from the behaviour of Sinn Féin. This is just one example. The Finance Minister fires out a statement last night. Again, the behaviour of those that believe they're supreme and people do as they're told rather than seeking consensus when it came to a budget. The supremacist attitude that exists within Sinn Féin is infecting our political institutions, it infects our society, and it has infected the police service, who were collaborators, who facilitated this, who were signing off on plans. They didn't engage, they didn't inform, and they certainly didn't enforce. I feel sorry for the rank and file, because they are lions led by lambs to the slaughter, and there's consequences for confidence in policing as a result of the way in which the very highest levels of the police are now infected by seeking to appease the Republican campaign that pervades. And that has to change, and that's why we're right to seek change. So there hasn't been a change, Mr. Speaker, in Sinn Féin's approach. There hasn't been an apology that stacks up. But Sinn Féin will need to learn very quickly. If you want to share power, if you want to build a society, you'll have to change your attitude, because you're causing huge damage to not just Northern Ireland, but but these political institutions.
Thank you, and I call Christopher Stalford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Sir, I think it's important that we place this debate in the context of the period of time that we've just lived through. Our people are living under crippling restrictions. Access to their friends, to their family, to their place of work is being actively restricted by the government. Our people have lost huge swathes of their liberty and their freedom. Our economy has been driven over a cliff in the name of controlling the COVID-19 virus. People have sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed over and over again in almost every aspect of their living day and their life. For many people, the epitome of the restrictions that they're living under, of course, relates to the circumstances in which they can bury their loved ones. I recall in June, when this issue first presenting to the Deputy First Minister at the Executive Office Committee the example of a constituent of mine from the Beaver Estate who had to bury her mother. And she was devastated at the behaviour of the Deputy First Minister, who up to that point she had said she admired the approach and the collaboration that was taking place between the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in trying to get COVID under control. We now know that the credibility of the government messaging was shot by the actions of the Deputy First Minister. And we also know what we saw with our own eyes. There were thousands of people in attendance at this funeral. It was widely advertised on social media. A PA system was set up in a cemetery in order to hold a political rally. There were hundreds of people at the wake house. And now we know that that was facilitated by the PSNI. Collusion with the state is clearly acceptable in certain circumstances. I find it outrageous that the Police Service of Northern Ireland should have acted in such a way. And like my colleague, I agree with him in expressing sympathy and support for the lower-ranking officers who are being extremely badly led. And I repeat the call of the First Minister that the Chief Constable of the PSNI should do the honourable thing and resign from his post. The conduct of Sinn Féin in relation to this matter is a slap in the face to everyone else who sacrificed so much during this period. And again, we heard on the floor of this chamber a classic politician's apology. I'm sorry if you were hurt. That's not the same thing as I'm sorry. I'm sorry if my actions offended you. That's not the same thing as I'm sorry. In fact, it puts the onus on the person who was hurt. Well, it's your fault that you're offended, but I'm sorry for that. People can see through such weasel words. The people who have been fined or cautioned or threatened with fines or had their access to beauty spots or other places restricted are now well within their rights to demand their money back, because it is now accepted principle in Northern Ireland that ignorance of the law is a defence. And if that is the case, then the PPS has fundamentally undermined their own credibility. The thing that sticks in people's craw most about this is that it reeks of a policy of entitlement and privilege. Do as I do, do as I say, but not as I do. And people have had enough of being governed like that. I recall the comments of the Deputy First Minister defending fines being issued to Black Lives Matter protesters. She said it was the right thing to do because we're trying to control the spread of the virus and the virus is killing people. She said that in the context of Black Lives Matter protesters. But seemingly, when Republican royalty die, that principle no longer applies. And I accept that the Deputy First Minister referred to Mr. Storey as her friend. And that's her right, that's her privilege. But there are other people who, because of policies and restrictions that she authored, weren't able to give their friends or their loved ones the send-off that they would have wanted. The hypocrisy is astonishing. Michelle O'Neill should resign.
Thank you. And I call Dolores Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would have to say that having to stand here today doesn't fill any of us, and certainly not me, with any great sense of joy. And today we have to remember that there are people burying their loved ones under the COVID restrictions who won't get the send-off that they deserve and the comfort that the family needs. We as a party had to bury colleagues of our own and adhere to the determinations and the restrictions. We had no confusion about them. It was stay at home. You know, it was about the numbers attending. We buried someone who won the Nobel Peace Prize. We buried John Dallet, a man who gave his whole life to public service without any political elitism or trappings that others did not receive. Members across the way buried recently their party colleague, Jimmy Spratt, another man who dedicated his life to public service. But the political elite in here are the members to my right. They have set themselves above all other followers of the rules and regulations in society today. And I regret the fact that the police are being the boys and girls caught in the middle, because today there are police officers out on the beat protecting people in our community and putting their lives at risk. So it's not right that they have been put in this position. And the PPS made it very clear that there was a lack of clarity over the regulations and interpretation. Who signed and put into law those very same regulations and restrictions? And I too did not hear, and I will give way to Ms O'Neill if she wants to make a fulsome apology here for offending not only people in this House, because this is not a green and orange issue, Mr Speaker. This reflects the anger and hurt that is right across the community. People who could not go and call at a house and give comfort to people that lost, families who had to draw lots to see who could attend their family member's funeral or not. And yes, there are questions for the police to answer. I'm just finished a meeting of the Policing Board in private, and there will be opportunity in public later on to hear the Chief Constable and the Senior Officer team being held to account for their decision making, and it is right and proper that it has done so. But the members to my right have questions to answer. I don't know what part of the public message on the motorway, as many of them drove down the M1 to go to that wake house or to go to that funeral, that did not know what stay at home meant, because the rest of us knew. The rest of us have stayed at home. The rest of us have sacrificed alongside our friends and neighbours and people right across this community. The political elitism, the arrogance that's within Sinn Féin is beyond belief. And I still have time if Ms O'Neill wants to stand and give her apology, or indeed Mr Murphy. I don't hear it. I don't hear it. The sound is deafening. Mr Speaker, we have seen reports in the papers, and we've heard people who don't normally be on the airways at all say how deeply hurt and how angry they are by what has happened. And it is right that that anger and that is acknowledged, and that hurt is acknowledged in this chamber, the chamber where people are elected to represent the voice and to be the voice of the people. So it's right and proper that this is the only democratic chamber. And if people had anything about them that would reflect on their actions and what they've said, you know, last year, just in the run-up to Christmas, there was a scandal in the south of Ireland, in Clifton, and it's actually last July, in what's now known as Golfgate. Mary Lou MacDonald said that it was chaotic and unstable government, and that people must and should be held to account. Do those same principles not apply in the north? Is that a petitionist attitude from Sinn Féin? Or do those principles apply only to every other party on the island of Ireland, but not to them? That's a question I would hope that some of them might address. She talked about one of the representatives, Phil Hogan, that he should resign, that it was very clear he had lost the confidence of government. Well, I'm telling Sinn Féin today, you've lost the confidence of members in this House because of your failure to take responsibility, failure to set the same standards for yourselves as you do for others, and I hope that you reflect on what damage you have done to not only the confidence and the hurt that you have caused to the people across Northern Ireland, but the way in which you have dragged policing into this debate by your actions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, and I call Mike Nesbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise as a member of the Assembly, obviously, but also declare membership of the Policing Board of Northern Ireland, but also acknowledge early in the pandemic I transgressed the regulations. A matter of continuing regret. I have no difficulty repeating my apology to this House and to the broader population. It was a wrong action, and I resigned as Deputy Chair of the Committee of the Executive Office because I felt it was untenable to continue in that role. All I can say is sometimes I think people do things that they can explain, but they cannot excuse. And I think this is one such occasion that we are debating today. And we're debating it because of a widespread public perception that there are people and organisations who are in some sense above the law. And that has implications for public confidence, not just in those organisations and individuals, but in organisations like the Public Prosecution Service and the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Some members have already made the point that the statement on Tuesday from the PPS is extraordinary in that it seems to suggest that ignorance is a defence, going against centuries-old legal maxim. Ignorance is no defence in the face of the law. There are some other extraordinary statements, I think, in the 9 pages published by the public prosecutor. On page 9, paragraph 24, he refers to a lack of clarity within the regulations. I have 2 issues with that. If the police service agree that there was a lack of clarity within the regulations, how could they possibly deploy the policy of the 4 E's of engage, explain, encourage and enforce? Because you cannot, if you're unclear, explain. Explain what? Regulations you do not understand. And also, if I may, every time the regulations are changed, there's a debate in this chamber, a debate which is recorded and transcribed into Hansard, the official record, verbatim, word for word. Find me one occasion when a member opposite has stood up during the debate and said to a minister explaining the changes, "I'm so sorry, I don't understand that. Would you please explain?"
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Would the member agree with me that what has happened over the course of this event is that the police have created a dangerous impression? The police will police those who they can police, while other people can get away without being policed.
The member has an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his intervention, and I think he reflects a commonly held public perception. I make a distinction between the leadership of the Police Service of Northern Ireland and those who are on the ground.
Thank the member for giving way, but will the member acknowledge that the police did send 24 files for prosecution?
I understand that, and the member will know that there were 2 reasons given by the PPS not to prosecute, and one of them was the engagement by the PSNI with the event organisers ahead of the funeral. And I understand that in principle, for a major public event, it is right for the police to liaise. But the question is, what was the nature of that engagement? And again, I go to the Public Prosecution Service report, the 9 pages. On page 4, paragraph 16.7, quotes from the goal strategy for the day. And it says that the purpose was to facilitate the funeral arrangements in a dignified manner which takes into account the wishes of the family, is sensitive to his community, and which does not significantly compromise public health. I find that extraordinary. What I would have wanted to read is that the PSNI wanted to facilitate funeral arrangements in a manner which upheld the regulations regarding public health, while at the same time doing everything possible to respect the wishes of the family and be sensitive to the community. It seems to me it's the wrong way around. So the police have questions to answer, and as Mrs Kelly says, there will be a public session with the Chief Constable at 4 o'clock this afternoon. I am very much of the opinion, and have been for a very long time, that the police had advanced written notice of the funeral plans, of everything from the wake to Milltown to Roselawn Cemetery. Mr Speaker, a few weeks before Mr Story was cremated, my mother was cremated at Roselawn Cemetery, aged 93. From memory, we were allowed 9 people in the crematorium, which was fortunate because she had 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and a minister, adding up to 9. A few weeks before she died, her best friend passed away, and her beloved St Columba's Church was filled to the brim with mourners. When my mother passed, we were into COVID, and the church wasn't even half empty. It was practically empty. She deserved better. But our glass is half full because we got a church service and we got a cremation. Those are the times we live in. Those are the conditions we have to accept.
Thank you, and I call Paul Frew.
Speaker, in Northern Ireland, indeed the whole of the island of Ireland, bereavement and the process encountered is extremely important. The wake brings such comfort to so many loved ones who will be in shock trauma. Looking back on my own life, wakes were critically important to me in helping to comfort me as a child. The acknowledgement, coming to terms, comforting each other, the mutual loss, the family friend in the corner, telling the room a funny story about the past. At that point, laughter, in amongst the tears, has the most healing qualities imaginable. The comfort of seeing so many folk turn up at a funeral of a dearly missed family member. They do not have to say anything. They just have to be there. You physically carrying your loved one on your shoulder, out of your... Yes, yeah.
I appreciate the member for giving way. Does the member agree with me that one of the things that's absolutely galling about this situation is that for week after week after week, the Deputy First Minister, alongside the First Minister and sometimes the Minister for Health and the Chief Medical Officer, have fronted up press conferences telling our people how essential these restrictions are?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for the intervention to my colleague. When you physically carry your loved one on your shoulder, out of your home place, along your local street, on their last journey, arm in arm with your brothers and cousins, it has a profound significance. Witnessing the burial of a loved one, no matter the weather, has a lasting anchoring in the mind to the place and time. A connect that will never be broken as long as you live. It is in this context, Mr Speaker, that we find ourselves in this horrendous situation, whereby a political party, whereby ministers in the executive, whereby MLAs in this place corrupted and copper-fastened that sense of loss in people who have been deprived of that relief. 12,000 multiplied by many times. That's the immeasurable number of people who have been impacted by the actions of Sinn Féin. It's not only anger that has gripped the people of Northern Ireland. It's not only frustration. It's a deep sense of sadness and depression. But more hurtful and impactful than that, Sinn Féin has spread a cloak of regret and, dare I say, a sense of guilt to all those people who buried loved ones without giving them the funeral service they deserved. All these families who sought guidance from undertakers into what could and couldn't take place. All those families who sought guidance from the local minister and priest of what could or couldn't take place. All those families and individuals who had to choose which brother, sister, cousin, nephew and niece could attend or not attend. How cruel is that? How cruel are these restrictions? How cruel is Sinn Féin? All these families and individuals knew or sought advice. They were all too aware of the restrictions. Yet the very people who formed the restrictions, created the law, scrutinised it, yet they make excuses that they didn't understand it. That's why they live their days now in regret and guilt. That's why those people who had to make difficult decisions and choices now live with regret and guilt. Mr. Speaker, this has always been about supremacy. When mourners were locked out of Roselawn, Sinn Féin were parading in their thousands down the street, organising sham funeral orations in Milltown, the place where the remains were not even interred. When Sinn Féin were promoting and organising travel arrangements, speaker systems, crowd control, negotiating with the PSNI and inserting their Sinn Féin plan, when law-abiding citizens could only give a small, humble send-off for fear of fine and penalty. Sinn Féin cannot be seen to be above the law. They have corrupted this process, this democratic process, the restrictions. They've corrupted the police actions. They've corrupted the actions of the PPS and their determinations. It is a corruption that cannot be tolerated. This is not 1930s Nazi Germany, and nor should our people have to live in that world. Thank you.
Thank you. And can we now bring Naomi Long on screen, please? Can I invite Naomi Long to make her contribution?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank members for the contributions that they've made to this debate already today. I really regret that we are having to have this discussion 8 months after Bobby's story was laid to rest. But it is necessary that we do so, because we have yet to have the unequivocal, unambiguous apology for the actions of the Deputy First Minister, of the Finance Minister, and indeed of Sinn Féin collectively, for the blatant breach of the regulations which took place. I think people have, and I think Sinn Féin have significantly underestimated the amount of hurt, the amount of grief, and the amount of anger that they have caused right across the community, and particularly for those families who themselves have had to lay their family members to rest in what have been extraordinarily difficult circumstances. We have seen people who went to hospital, who never got to hold hands with their loved one again after that point, who never got to journey with them on their final journey to the crematorium or the graveside, and who have been profoundly hurt, but also, I believe, profoundly damaged by what has been an incredibly painful experience. And whilst they were gracious and generous in making those tremendous sacrifices, it has been a burden for them to bear. But that has been made worse by the fact that those who made the rules did not make the same sacrifice when their turn came. And that, for many, has been a burden that is just too great. And I think that that explains why people are angry. It explains why people are upset. And it explains why people require us as an assembly to come together today to have this discussion and communicate that hurt and that anger to Sinn Féin members of the House. All of us recognise that at the centre of this there is a grieving family, and none of us would wish to compound their pain or their hurt. because we recognise the pain and hurt in our community over all of this. But we have to communicate accurately and honestly and candidly that what happened did not only breach the regulations, but it breached the bonds of trust that are required between elected representatives and those they represent, that we will hold ourselves to the same and higher standards than we do the rest of the community. That is what is expected of us, whether it is fair or not fair, and we have a duty of trust and a bond of trust with our constituents in the country that we have to uphold. With respect to the decisions this week, and members will appreciate that the way I'm speaking here as a leader of the Alliance Party, that I will not engage in commentary around the PSNI and the PPS, because as Justice Minister and in my role, I respect their independence and the integrity of their office. And so it's important that I don't stray into that territory. But I do think it is important that people fully understand what those rulings that the PPS were about. When it speaks to issues around confusion about the regulations, it is not to be critical of those who drafted the regulations. It is not to be critical of the police and how they interpreted the regulations. It is not either to exonerate those in Sinn Féin who claim they did not understand the regulations. It is simply to state that the prospect of prosecution based on some of the conflicts in the regulations and the rapid change was diminished as a result. But what is absolutely clear to me, having read the PPS decision and having sat at the executive table along with all of the other ministers when this was discussed, was that none of us could have been in any doubt what we were asking of our community, what we were asking of grieving families, what we were asking people to forego in the interests of public safety, of protecting lives and of protecting people's health. And irrespective of whether the regulations were not sustainable in terms of prosecution, there is no doubt in my mind that no one sitting at that table could have been in any doubt as to what the rules are when it came to gatherings and funerals, and we need to be absolutely clear about that. There are many wrongs in this world that cannot be prosecuted in court, but we can still apologise for those wrongs. We do not need to be found guilty in a court of law to know that we have broken the spirit.
Remember, bring your remarks to a close.
Created. And I would appeal again in my final comments to those in Sinn Féin to step up, to make that fulsome apology and to give some comfort at this late stage to the families who have been affected.
Thank you, and I call Jonathan Buckley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, when I woke up, I brought into sharp focus what today's debate is about. Today at 3 o'clock, my neighbour of 25 years will be buried. A lady whose table I ate at throughout my childhood, whose garden I played in. And that family will follow the restrictions put in place and make that tough decision as to who can and who cannot attend that funeral. And for many of them, it will be making a decision between families. Over 12,000 people have died in Northern Ireland from the Bobby Story funeral. Families right across the length and breadth of Northern Ireland, regardless of community, regardless of religious background, political preference, they have had to make the difficult decision to bury loved ones in isolation. I cannot but be moved by their accounts in which they've had to deal with. I listened to Mr. Nesbitt's account. How could you not be moved? I've listened to Kellie Armstrong's, Edwin Poots. How many other stories do we have of where they feel almost a sense of regret that they were not able to bury their loved ones in a manner which they felt was befitting for their memory? But they followed the regulations. They followed the law. You know, Mr. Speaker, I think what the public rightly want to see today is remorse from Sinn Féin, is an apology, is recognition of the hurt caused, and going a step further and say, we're sorry for what we did and take action. Because at the heart of Sinn Féin's mantra is respect, honesty, integrity, and indeed equality. But I, as an elected representative in this House, and many of the people that I talk to, can only conclude by their actions you will know them. And for Sinn Féin, it is very much a case of ourselves alone. That's regrettable. Northern Ireland has come a long way over many dark years of our past, where politicians and political parties have had to work together for the common interest. But I'm sad to say it, but that message has been undermined and undermined by the party opposite. We've all had to play a part, a shared effort, and obeyed life-altering circumstances, even at the behest of social and economic well-being. Few in society have been confused by the term lockdown, but we are expected to believe that 24 Sinn Féin representatives were blissfully unaware that the rules applied to them. Really? Is that how low politics in Northern Ireland has got? Any prosperous and free society relies on a fair police and a just law. So we are right to examine the police actions throughout all of this. Because by the 24th of June 2020, police were aware that Sinn Féin were preparing a management plan for the funeral, and police intended to comply the plan in terms of public safety and traffic management. Listening to the Nolan show yesterday, when I listened to ACC Todd give an account of how he policed that operation, I, like many other members, were confused. Who was ACC on that day? Was it ACC Todd or was it ACC Jerry Kelly? Because the public are rightly asking the question today, who was in control? Because it certainly wasn't law enforcement. In fact, policing responsibilities were handed over to Sinn Féin, which was an absolute dereliction of duty. I will.
The member giving way, the police having surrendered the streets of West Belfast to Sinn Féin, then justified not intervening because there would have been a real threat of violence. Is that not outrageous for the police to use that as an excuse for handing over the police to Sinn Féin to manage?
Member has in place a minute.
Thank you, and I think the member nails the point very well. Because let's face it, where was the efforts to engage? Where was the efforts to explain, encourage and ultimately enforce the regulations during Bobby Story's funeral? Their conduct only serves to draw the conclusion that many have sadly come to, that Sinn Féin are above the law that they set. The Chief Constable has to consider his position. He has to go, because there is a crisis of confidence, and members need to take note of that. But the senior police leadership team, and I've mentioned ACC Todd, a man charged with the task of upholding the rule of law, abided and abated the breaking of the law, he let down and undermined the very police officers that have had such a difficult job throughout this COVID. We've asked them to do some incredibly difficult things. In closing, Mr. Speaker, we were told and heralded the new decade, new approach. There has been a new decade, but there's no new approach. And Sinn Féin need to reflect upon the damage that they have done to Northern Ireland society by their actions and by their failure to own up, recognise their misgivings and deal with the situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, and I call Matthew O'Toole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's important that we are clear on what today's debate is and is not about. This debate is not about Bobby Story or his family, who are entitled to respect and privacy as they grieve, and I'm sure are still grieving. So it is incumbent on us that we remain measured and respectful in our language and in our tone. Nor is this debate, despite what some have said, about broader perceptions of policing or criminal justice decisions. There are other channels for those questions to be asked and debated. This debate is about the actions of senior politicians, indeed serving ministers in this Assembly. We hold ministers to account for their performance in office every day that this Assembly sits. That is core to the functioning of the Assembly and of any legislature. This institution is imperfect and frequently dysfunctional, but it is essential. Despite all the difficulties and complexities in this society, people want political power exercised locally, but that means that those who hold power must be held accountable for their actions. That is why we are here today. When we first debated the coronavirus regulations in this chamber, many of us remarked on the extraordinarily invasive restrictions that we were placing on the everyday lives of citizens. Notwithstanding the various amendments, these regulations are still in place more than a year after they were first enacted. For more than a year of our lives, we have lived with enormous restrictions that would have previously been simply unthinkable. I remember saying myself in this chamber, as others did last year, that restrictions on funerals and wakes would be especially difficult. But those restrictions were necessary in order to deal with a threat that was previously unthinkable, a virus that has killed nearly 3 million people around the world, including more than 2,000 in Northern Ireland, 7,000 across the island of Ireland, and 127,000 across the UK. The public accepted and have complied with these restrictions on the basis of a social contract between the state and citizen. An implicit part of that contract is the understanding that those who make the laws are bound to follow them like everyone else. We make the laws, and so we have to be willing to make the same sacrifices and be seen to make them that others have made. There is, Mr. Speaker, an Irish way of death that spans major denominational differences and even includes those of us who are not religious. It is a shared cultural instinct towards coming together and enveloping families in support, solidarity and love. I have no doubt that some of those same sincere instincts were what lay behind the gathering last June the 30th. But given the cultural importance of marking death here, ordinary people are entitled to ask, why not me? Why not my family? Why was my loss less important than someone else? Hundreds, if not thousands, of families have lost loved ones in circumstances where they were not only unable to mark the passing in a proper funeral, many didn't even see their loved one before they died in a hospital or care home. Many weren't able to view the remains of their loved one due to the restrictions that we in this chamber enacted last year and those ministers in the executive signed off on. And probably all of us, and it's been alluded to already in this debate, will have experienced real regret at not having been present in churches or funeral homes or graveyards to mark the passing of someone we knew. It may not have been a family member or even a close friend, but someone we knew, someone we admired, someone in our community or neighbourhood whose life meant something to us, even in a small way, and who we felt we owed the small debt of bearing witness to their life. But we didn't, and many hundreds and thousands of others didn't, because those rules were made to protect us all. The idea of the social contract that I mentioned earlier was first emerged in the 18th century, at the same time as another idea, the Republic. At the core of the idea of a republic, and therefore surely at the core of the values of anyone who is Republican, is the principle of equal citizenship. The idea that unlike other systems, all citizens are equal before the law and all rules apply to everyone equally. Mr. Speaker, whatever the finding of the PPS, whatever conversations happened with police officers, however complicated the changes in the regulations, it is clear that multiple breaches of the rules took place on June 30th last year and by senior members of the executive. And people of all backgrounds, especially those who have lost loved ones and not had the same opportunity to mark their passing, are offended. They are offended because the principle of equal citizenship, an idea core to the principles of a republic, have been clearly undermined. The very least they can expect is a clear and sincere apology. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Alex Easton.
Mr. Speaker, on the 30th of June last year, over 2,000 people, including members of this Assembly, attended the funeral of Bobby Story. Every day before and every day since, for the duration of this pandemic, families across this country have lost loved ones. Many have not been able to visit their dying loved ones in hospital. Some have had to say goodbye on the phone. Some of the stories that we have heard are frankly inhumane. But there is one rule for Sinn Féin and another for everybody else. If that has been me as a unionist politician, you can guarantee that I would have been arrested by the PSNI and recommended for prosecution by the PPS and taken to court and fined. I would probably have been asked to resign by my party. I would have basically been hung, drawn and quartered. It is absolutely clear, and it pains me to say, but there is a two-tier political policing system because of the fear of Sinn Féin that they will be upset and the underlying threat that there's a potential of violence. Yes.
Giving way, he makes a very valid point with regards to the policing and the political party of Sinn Féin, in that there was warning signs days before the funeral with regards to the wake, where 400 people, I think, attended the wake of the deceased. Surely that should have sent sirens in both political party Sinn Féin and the PSNI.
Member has an additional minute.
Thank the member for his comments, and you're right, that should have sent a warning signal to both the PSNI and Sinn Féin. The facts are, and I hate to say it, but Sinn Féin are treating my community like dirt and this assembly. And it needs to stop, and it needs to stop now, and that's how Sinn Féin are making me feel in my community. The decision of the PPS not to prosecute was sadly predictable. That doesn't make it less abhorrent. The most unbelievable part of this entire episode is that the decision has been justified on the basis that members of this Assembly were confused by the rules, something I don't recall ever being mentioned last year. Where do I begin with this, Mr. Speaker? With thousands of families across this country that have carefully abided by the restrictions when holding funerals. With the fact that Sinn Féin ministers in attendance helped draft and improve these regulations in the Executive. With the fact that these members have repeatedly criticised those who have taken part in other large gatherings. Or perhaps a good starting point is to actually believe the PPS. Let's all pretend for a moment that Sinn Féin members that went to the funeral were genuinely confused about the rules. In that case, why don't they share their confusion with the PSNI when they met them to discuss the funeral arrangements? Mr. Speaker, perhaps there is a considerable difference between 30 and 2,000 that can't be used as an excuse. I have never heard a more ridiculous justification for a decision with such a huge ramifications. The position of my party is that the Chief Constable should resign. There is a considerable list of failings that have led me to this conclusion. This is not an orange or green issue. People on all sides of the constitutional debate are rightly angry about what has happened, and many have lost faith in the Chief Constable. However, it must be said that the union's community in particular has lost confidence, especially in the Chief Constable, and policing here relies on cross-community consent. The Chief Constable appears oblivious to the damage that has been done to the unionist confidence in policing, and this is the latest in a catalogue of mishaps by the Chief Constable. There's been long talk of a two-tier policing in Northern Ireland, and those at the top of the police insist that this is not the case. Yes.
I'm grateful to my colleague for giving way. Would the member agree with me that what we have here is not a case of confusion, but actually collusion? They plotted and conspired jointly, the police and Sinn Féin, to put in place the arrangements for this funeral.
Yes, there's absolutely no confusion whatsoever. If it is mere perception, then how does one explain the Story funeral and the subsequent investigation compared with how the unionist community have been treated? The Chief Constable still does not seem to grasp the political repercussions of how this has been handled. On another matter, the Deputy First Minister was only interviewed 5 months after the event took place. Meanwhile, the PSNI continue to issue on-the-spot fines to members of the public and can arrest loyalists within 3 days for alleged breaches of COVID regulations. They normally do so with less evidence than we have for Sinn Féin members attending that funeral. There is a picture of the Deputy First Minister at the funeral with a man's arm around her. Some people in this country haven't hugged their mother for years. Policing of this event has made a total mockery of the regulations. The actions of the Deputy First Minister and other Sinn Féin politicians last year undermined the public message, and I have no doubt it reduced public compliance. Yet throughout this most recent lockdown, the vast majority of people have continued to follow the restrictions. The decision not to prosecute by the PPS, I fear, will absolutely shatter compliance with restrictions. As a result of what happened, I've already heard about cases in which people who receive fines are now going to challenge that in the courts. How can they tell members of the public with any authority that their businesses must close, that they must not see their families, and that they must not leave their homes? The public will laugh at us. I would like to conclude, Mr. Speaker. The apology of the Deputy First Minister was not enough and is not good enough. She has failed to acknowledge any wrongdoings on her part. It remains my view that her position is untenable and that she would resign, but you just don't care. The Deputy First Minister has no authority to lecture people on what they should do and should not be doing at present, because the message on COVID regulations have now been shattered. The Chief Constable must also consider his refusal to resign. He should reflect on the magnitude of these events, on the confidence in policing Northern Ireland. What happened, finally, Mr. Speaker, last June and the decisions in recent days cannot and should not be ignored. There must be serious consequences as a result of the actions of Sinn Féin.
Thank you, and I call Jerry Carroll.
Mr. Speaker, People Before Profit have consistently opposed police powers to fine and prosecute people for gathering throughout this pandemic, because this virus should be approached with a proper public health response, not a tougher police state. And the Executive utterly failed to deliver the health response we needed, and in imbuing the police with more powers have created the conditions for minorities to be targeted. And when the debates kicked off last year, Mr. Speaker, around this funeral, we had no truck, therefore, in calling for prosecutions against Michelle O'Neill or indeed others for attending funerals, particularly when such a spectacularly disparate approach had been taken to other gatherings by those often leading the charge. That is not where the disparities end, though, of course, Mr. Speaker. You will be aware that for some time now, I have strongly rebuked the disproportionate approach of the PSNI to gatherings across the north throughout this pandemic. There seems to be a thread which links those events which have been strongly targeted by the police, which I don't think we can ignore today or at the rest of this pandemic. It appears that those standing up against systemic oppression have been treated differently than those who are in or well connected to Stormont. A gathering of predominantly women protesting against sexism and violence after the murder of Sarah Everard a few weeks ago was targeted, and fines of up to £500 were doled out. A handful of people commemorating the Sean Graham bookmakers massacre a few months ago ended very seriously, facing unnecessary hostility from the PSNI. And as I know some in this chamber, or some who have called in by video today, are tired of hearing, a gathering of people taking a stand against racial injustice were targeted first by politicians in this room who passed last-minute regulations, secondly by the police who kettled people in an unsafe way which broke social distancing measures, and thirdly by the justice system itself, which continues to go after them for prosecutions. None of these gatherings of people would have had the benefit of claiming the regulations were too complicated. None of these groups had the benefit of being offered police assistance to work through and manage their events. In fact, in relation to the Black Lives Matter protest, I know that police went after organisers the night before the event, attempting to hand out cautions before any gathering had taken place. These people were faced with police repression, fines, threats of prosecutions and arrests for some. When you compare this to the likes of how Michelle O'Neill or Sammy Wilson has been treated, the disparity could not be clearer. And what astounds me further, Mr. Speaker, is the brazen hypocrisy. Sammy Wilson has made a habit out of actively flouting the regulations, including going into an ice cream shop without wearing a mask. He didn't care how dangerous it was, he didn't like the regulations, and he knew he could flout them with impunity. What a brass neck then for Sammy or his party to lead the charge on others who have broken or may have broken regulations during this pandemic. Similarly, I think the fact that Michelle O'Neill has refused to retract her comments about the police response to the Black Lives Matter protest being proportionate when she herself was involved in a gathering which appeared to be less socially distant is hypocritical. I've asked her before, and I'll put it to her again today, when will she apologise for the defence of the PSNI's actions and stand on the side of those who were disproportionately targeted on that day? Moreover, in the wake of Minister O'Neill not being fined or prosecuted, this Executive should move swiftly to ensure that prosecutions for others gathering are quashed. Ordinary people, including the most marginalised, have been targeted, while those in power and the bosses who force people into unsafe workplaces have been left untouched. What a terrible look for this executive. Fitting though, as the report shows how Stormont's racial equality strategy has utterly failed, and the First Minister refuses to meet with the leaderships of the trade union movement here in the North. Disgraceful stuff. I want to issue a warning, Mr Speaker. If the case against the Black Lives Matter protesters is allowed to proceed through the courts and results in prosecutions, the impact on the lives and careers of those protesters will have been caused by the Executive and its ministers. It will be on your hands, so do something about it. Otherwise, I imagine it will be very, very difficult to answer the question, how can it be the case that those who took the most stringent measures to socially distance and who met in the smallest groups were those targeted with a heavy-handed police response, yet those who didn't so much as wear a mask were not? It would be the reverse if the police responses were about COVID at all, but it's not. It's about who you are and why you're gathering, and the state has sent out a very clear message. Organising around police brutality, violence against women by a police officer, or collusion by the state.
Remember, bring us remarks to a close.
Establishment politicians, on the other hand, untouchable. So I will continue to call out this rank hypocrisy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call Claire Sugden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I wish to begin by thanking all those who have kept to the rules this past year. I know it has been a difficult year, it has been a significant sacrifice. Daily I hear stories, people crying to me on the telephone about missed appointments for critical surgeries, not being able to see their loved ones, pleading with me to give them permission to travel to see someone they haven't seen in years because that's all they have. I also pay tribute to all those lives that have been lost over the past year. I'm sorry that as an Assembly we had to take measures which saved more lives. I'm sorry that we stopped people mourning in the way that they should have expected. Mr Speaker, I will begin this where it should end, and that's with political leadership. I am so disappointed in the Deputy First Minister and others. I'm disappointed not least because they have yet to give a fulsome apology, apologising for their actions, not apologising for someone's hurt. You don't own their hurt to apologise for it. You own your actions which led to their hurt. So if there was anything meaningful that can come out of today's session, Deputy First Minister, it is that you apologise for what you did, because it leads me to believe that if this circumstance were to happen again, if you had a choice to take in attending another funeral in similar circumstances, you would do it again. And sadly, the people of Northern Ireland believe the same. People are so angry. They are angry since last July. The messaging around the COVID regulations was diminished at the point in which you appeared at that funeral. Sure.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way, and I was very interested in what she just said. Does she agree with me what this illustrates is not the people, not the health service, not the economy, the movement always comes first with Sinn Féin, and they're not a conventional political party in the sense that every other party in this chamber is.
The member has an extra minute.
Thank you, and thank you for the member's contribution. I will summarise in saying that I don't believe there was any political leadership here. And the members on this side of the House have as much responsibility to everyone in Northern Ireland, not least the people that they would have vote for them. And it's disappointing to see that that's what was put above the people of Northern Ireland last year. And whether you believed that you knew the regulations or not, you acted against the spirit of the regulations. And further, it is your job to know the regulations. So if you're claiming ignorance, then you're also admitting to incompetence. As a political leader, as Deputy First Minister, as Finance Minister, as members of the Policing Board, as members of this House, we are held to a higher standard because people look to us as an example. So no, it is not an excuse to say you did not know. If there was any doubt, you should not have been there. But you intentionally flirted with the rules, hoping that it wouldn't be noticed. But it was. It was noticed by every person in Northern Ireland, in particular those grieving families. I can say a lot about what happened this week. I think ultimately it is per political leadership. To an extent, I think it's per legislation, and I also think it's inconsistent application of said legislation. I agree with the Justice Minister insofar as the criminal justice system is there to seek to prove an alleged crime, and to an extent that can be difficult. But I have significant concerns that police didn't even seek to gather evidence, which is a critical part of that system. I also share comments with other members in relation to policing and the confidence in policing, and I feel very sorry for police officers on the ground. I feel particularly sorry for them in my constituency, where we are expecting people to descend onto the North Coast. And not just that, we are expecting people to come and to break the rules because they feel that there will be no consequences to that. That gives rise to a very uncertain summer in Northern Ireland, and that worries me. And I would appeal to everyone in Northern Ireland that you are better for following the rules. You are saving lives in doing so, and don't let the bad example of others be a discourage to that. Mr. Speaker, this month, 10th of April, we recognise 23 years since the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement was a significant leap for all people in Northern Ireland, from all sides. They accepted things that no person should have to accept, but they did that for the sake of peace, and they did that for the sake of a better future. Last July, we saw thousands of people in uniform on the streets of Belfast. I don't think that goes towards the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. I don't think that is conducive to an inclusive society, and I don't think that is conducive to a peace that those people sacrificed. And it's the sacrifices of the last year that we have to be acutely aware of today. And I would ask the all leaders of this House, even those who broke the rules, and I appreciate Mr Nesbitt's contribution. He did break the rules. He said sorry for breaking the rules, and he took action which was symbolic to his apology. I want to see that from the Deputy First Minister. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you. And I call Conor Murphy.
I welcome the opportunity that this debate gives me personally to set out my own position on the funeral of Bobby Storey. Hurt has been caused to many families who had to bury their loved ones during this unprecedented health crisis. This was never my intention, nor do I believe was the intention of anyone involved in the funeral. However, hurt was caused, and I apologise for that unreservedly. And let me be absolutely clear, the law does not distinguish between one set of people and another, or one funeral and another. I'm not even sure who's speaking to me. Can't go. Well, okay, you have your chance to speak later on, and I'll not interrupt you. The law doesn't distinguish Cancora between one set of people and another, nor one funeral and another, nor should it. And I accept and cooperated with the police investigation into these events. The PPS has now said it will review the decision it made, and I await the outcome of that review. I accept fully the outcome of these processes. However, let me reiterate here again today that I do regret the political division that this has caused in the Assembly, and to the public health messaging that we worked so hard to develop as a collective and agreed response to this terrible pandemic. More importantly, however, I want to say to the wider community, but most particularly to apologise fully, I want to say sorry to the wider community, but more particularly to apologise fully and unreservedly to those families who were hurt in any way by my actions.
And I call Doug Beattie to wind the motion.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In winding this motion, I reflect on the last nearly 2 hours of a most robust debate, which was heated, certainly passionate, moving, and it was angry at times. The debate ebbed and flowed, as it has done in this chamber and outside of this chamber, about an issue, as Paul Frew says, about bereavement, which absolutely goes to the heart of our society and how we remember those loved ones that we lost. And I thank everybody for their contribution to the debate. I timed Sinn Féin's contribution. It was 4 minutes. 4 minutes in a 2-hour debate nearly of setting out their stall in this. And it's just not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. We needed to hear more. We heard nothing. It was doubling down on the position you were in before we came here today. Policing and justice Mr. Speaker, has been damaged. Of course it's been damaged. But like everybody in this room, or many people in this room, I have to reiterate that we cannot lay the blame on the rank-and-file police officer who gets a set of regulations which we write, he interprets them, and then at the sharp end of justice, he has to deliver, and he will make mistakes. People have pointed out the mistakes made by the Gold Commander at the funeral. And yes, he has made mistakes. Absolutely, he has made mistakes. If he had worked on the enforcement aspect of the engagement, we may not be where we are today. If he had simply said, do you know what, you see that Milltown eulogy? It's not acceptable, it ain't happening, go away and rethink it. Then we may not be where we are today. And the Chief Constable has come under serious scrutiny and serious criticism, and I have to say, regrettably, it's justified, because he is the head of a police force like no other. This is not Kent, this is not the Midlands, this is Northern Ireland. We have a very distinct policing issue here, and unfortunately he has in many ways failed to regard that or understand it. But please, Mr. Speaker and other elected members, let's not lose sight here of what happened. The very fact this issue came about because a political party, Sinn Féin, sat down in ministerial positions and made up rules and regulations that they told everybody to adhere to, and they did not. They just did what they wanted to do, and they cannot get away in the smoke as we start focusing on other people. It was not a decision made by mistake. It was a decision taken deliberately, knowing the consequences, organising the funeral in detail with the police, even organising the wake, as Mr. Stalford clearly pointed out, and proudly saying we organised the wake, although the rules say you're not allowed to have a wake. There were signs pointing to people to go to the wake. This was compounded when the party refused to apologise, refused to show attrition. They simply promoted the idea that they were above everybody else, that they had some kind of privilege that we do not. And they were directed how they should do this funeral by the IRA Army Council because they wanted to remember one of their own. That's the reality. Because if they'd shown political understanding, they wouldn't have done it. Nichola Mallon, I'll not, Paul, if you don't mind, I just want to shoot through it. Nichola Mallon, Mike, Nesbitt and Claire Sugden raised the issue of the guidelines were confusing. It's an embarrassing defence. Absolutely embarrassing. Because if I was going to organise something, no matter what it was, a garden event, anything, the first thing I would do is get out the rules and regulations in my hand and I would reread them. Because I may well have forgotten them over time. It is not a defence. It should never be a defence. It can't be a defence. Many members in this chamber will have received emails from constituents outlining the hurt that they have felt over this last number of months. I have received emails, even last night, moving emails, where you're just reading them, you can recount the hurt that's been delivered on these people because they saw one getting something that they were not allowed, and that was to be able to say goodbye to their loved ones in the manner that they wanted. I think Kellie Armstrong's contribution on this issue was very moving. And Dolores outlining members of her party and her friends who they could not attend their funerals highlights the issue well. Integrity shown by a party who adhered to the rules and the regulations. And of course my friend Mike Nesbitt, who lost his mother. No fanfare, no funerals, no lining the route, no ushers, no black and whites, no 2,000 people coming out in the street. I couldn't even attend my friend's mother's funeral to show him support. Why? He adhered to the rules. The PPS finding on this issue, as we watched it all unfold on TV, as people deliberately broke the rules and sort of says, oh, you can't see, I'm breaking the rules. It was there for us all to see on television. And the PPS findings are absolutely staggering. 24 recommendations for prosecution, none taken forward. Mary Lou MacDonald and Jerry Adams weren't even questioned or investigated, and no file was put forward. Why? Staggering. I wrote to the DPP on Tuesday night, and I says, this is having a material effect on my constituents. You must review. Now, I don't know if he took my letter and says, well, let's review, or somebody else did similar, or lots of people did similar, but it's being reviewed, and let's see the review, and let's see the outcome, and let's get some meat on the bones of a decision that was taken, which is fundamentally wrong, and we know it was fundamentally wrong, but this is what it feels like. This is what it feels like to the ordinary people out in the street. It feels like a criminal, maybe a thief, has gone before the courts and got away on a technicality and has come out sneering, only to do the same thing all over again. Difference being, we didn't even get it to court, where so many other people are brought to court. This debate won't have any binding outcomes. It's an opportunity to express our views, and people will know that we're just expressing our views. And they will hope that it's all forgotten about in the days and the weeks to come. But it can't be. Because you are the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. And you are our Finance Minister. And you have shown no integrity. You have shown no moral courage. You have shown no compassion. You have shown no understanding for the very people you're telling us that you represent. And I'm not talking about anybody green or orange. I'm talking about the everyday people who go to work every day to make a living, adhere to the rules that we set, that you did not set. Your apology is poor. It was not an apology. Nothing's changed. In the 4 minutes that you gave us, nothing has changed. And that apology needs to be about what you did. And that is, we organised a funeral, and we delivered a funeral, and we delivered a wake outside the rules and the regulations. I have to apologise for that. That's what you have to do. My friend Mike Nesbitt apologised. Folsom, I felt it. And he's apologised to me and my party in private. That's a measure of integrity. Claw back your compassion. Claw back your integrity. Claw back your moral authority. Apologise, then resign, because that's where we are. And Mr. Speaker, in the last 30 seconds, can I just say something very quickly in regards to this debate? Do not let Sinn Féin set your moral agenda on this particular issue. Please, everybody, adhere to the health regulations. Do not break it, because it will cost lives. And that breach 9 months ago cost lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, members. And members, the question is that the motion standing on the order of paper be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Thank you to all the members for their contributions this morning. Thank you. Item 3 on the order paper is the adjournment. The question is that the Assembly do now adjourn. The Assembly is adjourned. Thank you.